split from shoulder to waist, buried up to your neck while a wooden saw slowly removes your head, or boiled into human soup. Welcome to the feudal era Japan, where honor, shame, and unimaginable pain collided, and where even the fiercest warriors weren't spared. We're exploring the brutal world of ancient torture in today's episode of the Infographic Show, why one torture device made even samurai beg for death. Don't forget to hit subscribe. This is one history lesson you won't forget. Number 9. Sword testing. Splitting someone in half from shoulder to waist is going to take a very sharp sword. And it's a good thing the Japanese were arguably the finest swordsmiths in the world. Each blade was meticulously forged, folded, and hardened. But how do you test a sword meant to cut through bone and armor? Simple. You test it on the real thing, an actual human body. Cadavers were sometimes used, but according to Japanese historians, a condemned prisoner might be the unfortunate candidate chosen to show off a sword maker's skills. The practice, tameshigiri or test cutting, was big in the 17th century during the Edo period. If the condemned man was indeed sliced in two, the swordsman would be congratulated for his skills. The sword he'd used to slice and dice would be inscribed with a cutting signature, thereby increasing its value. A couple cups of sake later, a few guys from the outcast class that we'll discuss later mopped up the human organs and everyone went home happy. Being chopped down the middle like someone in a Final Destination movie was probably a daunting prospect for the prisoner. There was a famous story in Japan in which a prisoner about to have his body divided told the executioner, "Well, had I known you were going to split me in two, I'd have swallowed some stones." Number 8. Reverse hanging. Medieval Europe practically wrote the playbook on torture. One of their go-to methods was the strappado, hauling someone into the air by their arms, tied tightly behind their back. It often ended in death. But even if it didn't, survivors were left with shredded nerves, torn ligaments, and shoulders that might never move again. Let's just say lifting a pint of ale was not happening. And while Europe was yanking arms from sockets, Japan had its own version. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it became vogue to treat certain kinds of prisoners to the torture method of tsurushi, hanging. This was a time when seafaring Europeans began arriving on Japan's shores, bringing not just trade but missionaries. The foreign preachers shared stories of Jesus Christ and his ultimate sacrifice for humanity. At first, the sermonizing was tolerated, but as more Japanese civilians embraced the Christian God, the authorities grew suspicious. And when tolerance ran out, they didn't just push back, they cracked down hard. The records show that in the 16th century, 26 European missionaries were executed on the same day in possibly the worst way possible, much worse than being chopped in two. They were crucified, which kicked off a period of mass persecution. All Christians were banned, but not all heeded the call to pack up and leave. At least the Japanese officials gave them a chance to renounce their faith, and that is where the hanging comes in. They were hanged by the feet or from their hands tied behind their backs, and if they renounced, they were spared. Some were broken, taken down, and healed, and the process was started all over again until they renounced. The pain was so severe that some missionaries did renounce, and according to one historian, they went back to Europe, begging God to forgive them. About 2,000 in total chose to die, making themselves martyrs in the process. The survivors who did make it back home told tales of Japanese sadism, saying the torture techniques were utterly gruesome, which was kind of hypocritical given the Europeans burned accused witches. But just as in those Japanese game shows of the 80s and 90s, the medieval-era Japanese liked to humiliate their prisoners. One of the punishments consisted of tying a Christian by his feet and lowering him into a pit filled with human excrement. The men weren't actually suffocated in the poop, which would have been way too fast. The objective was to shame them. The actual aim of upside-down hanging was to cause pain or death by way of a buildup of blood to the head. Hanging upside down for just 20 minutes can lead to swelling, cerebral edema, which can cause a stroke or brain hemorrhage. The heart would be working harder to get the blood to the legs, which would cause a heart attack if you haven't already died of respiratory failure. So yes, the poop trough wasn't the issue, blood to the head was. But the Japanese officials had a way of making dying a much slower process. They sliced the victim's forehead, which reduced the pressure on the brain. This gave the missionary ample opportunity to tell his captors that Jesus Christ and God were actually not as real as he once thought they were. Okay, let's move on. We still have lots to cover. Number 7. Stone pressing. As you've seen so far, the Japanese had torture techniques that were very similar to what the Europeans were doing back in the Middle Ages. For instance, in Europe, a standard torture was called pressing, when a condemned person was crushed under stones. The cause of death was usually suffocation or organ damage, and it could take several days. There are even cases when the public jumped on, to put the victim out of his misery. Of course, the Japanese version was a little more high-tech. They used finely cut slabs of stone rather than lots of heavy rocks, with an added twist of making the condemned man kneel on what was called a soraban board. It was kind of a mat that was made out of wooden triangles, thereby crushing the knees. The practice, known as ishidaki, can be translated into stone hugging, which is kinda cute. But the process was anything but gentle. Victims were forced into a rigid kneeling position on the soraban board, its wooden spikes digging deep into their legs. Then came the stones. One by one, they were stacked onto the victim's back and shoulders. It was a long, drawn-out affair that just added agony to the agony. Torturers might offer a sip of water or even remove a stone only to add it back minutes later. It was a slow and painful death. Now let's look at one of Japan's most lurid executions. Number 6. Boiling. Japanese warrior rulers during the Middle Ages occasionally boiled a person to death, just like they occasionally did in England, Scotland, Germany, and the Netherlands. But the Japanese did it better. They made it a family affair, or at least that's what they did with the Japanese noble outlaw Ishikawa Goemon, who was executed on October 8, 1594. The legend states that he'd been born into a samurai family, but after his father was murdered, he'd left a life of comfort and became an espionage and assassination specialist, otherwise known as a ninja. He spent the rest of his adult days with a band of thieves, seriously annoying feudal lords by handing out their riches to the poor. He was arrested when he attempted to assassinate a leading politician in Kyoto. The punishment, boiling, was as usual to be public, and his family was sentenced to join him in the pot. If you were lowered into a vat of boiling water, you would immediately experience agonizing pain. After a minute or so, your nerve endings would be burned through, and then the subcutaneous fat would start to cook. And then, as your internal organs cooked, you would go into shock. Goemon's boiling death is just one example of what a historian said were countless brutal deaths during this period, the Edo period, 1603 to 1867. He said that the shogun always walked a fine line between being seen as a man of justice and a cruel leader. For instance, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, who governed Japan as the 5th shogun of the Edo period from 1680 to 1709, was seen as a particularly harsh ruler. In his writings, the great Japanese historian of the era, Arai Hakuseki, wrote that Tsunayoshi had entire families put to death because one of their members had, quote, mistreated a bird. Sure, no one likes bird violence, but those executions were maybe a little too extreme. It's said that Tsunayoshi banished families to other regions, tens of thousands of people, for minor infractions. People have lost all sense of security, wrote Hakuseki. However, Hakuseki said that a century before Tsunayoshi's rule, life had been even worse for minor criminals. In those days, a lowly peasant could be executed for stealing one single penny, often in the most brutal manner. But before we talk about that, let's look at what happened to the samurai when they broke the rules. Number 5. Seppuku. According to Hakuseki, when a samurai was condemned to death, the execution was almost always seppuku, taking a knife known as a tanto to the guts and splitting the stomach wide open. In the book Bushido, The Soul of Japan, seppuku is described as a process by which warriors could expiate their crimes, apologize for errors, escape from disgrace, redeem their friends, or prove their sincerity. In short, it was a very noble way to die. The samurai was basically saving his family a lot of trouble by keeping them in the loop in Japan's extremely status-obsessed culture. There were different styles of seppuku, which included left-to-right cut, known as ichimonji, said to have been an elegant way of disembowelment, although elegance is not the word that naturally springs to mind. Another style was jumonji, which consisted of the left-to-right cut with a vertical slice up the ribcage for some added flair. The question is, did it hurt? Usually, no one survived to answer that important question, but there have been a handful of botched seppuku. One of the most infamous cases featured a celebrated poet and author, an ultra-nationalist who had little praise for Western materialism or globalism. His name, or rather his pen name, was Yukio Mishima. In 1970, during an attempt to incite a coup d'etat in which he shouted about the glorious samurai and service to the emperor, he committed seppuku. Well, he tried to. As he screamed in agony, his second-in-command, Masakatsu Morita, tried to chop off his head, but after 3 attempts, Mishima was still rolling around in a pool of blood. A third man, Hiroyasu Koga, completed the task, but not before Mishima had experienced absolute agony. So, was seppuku painful? Absolutely. And it was a lot worse if you didn't have a crew ready to finish the job. In the early days of seppuku, the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, it was always supposed to be a one-man act. But as the history books show, it was a lot harder than it seemed. A better way was to point the end of the sword at your heart and fall on it, but as you can imagine, occasionally some men weren't up to the task, and that's why the whole bloody operation was later perfected. It was sometime later, during the end of the Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573, that the third man was introduced. Later in the Edo period, seppuku was standardized and became more of a formal ritual. The act of decapitation, kaishaku, consisted of an assistant, a kaishakunin, who would decapitate the disemboweled man. This was an honor bestowed on the assistant, but if he didn't slice off the head in one swing, he too would become disgraced. And that's why there was always a backup. And as you already know, it's one of the reasons why the Japanese practiced on cadavers and prisoners. In the 18th century, some of the faint of heart introduced fan seppuku, which was a definite improvement if you didn't like pain. The condemned samurai merely held a fan that was supposed to represent a knife. It symbolized the act of evisceration, and then the assistant took off his head. In terms of being killed by the state, this was about as dignified as it got. As you'll now see, mere peasants and the odd European had it much, much worse. Number 4. Crucifixion. When we think of dying on the cross, we usually have images of sandals and sand-crusted beards and red Roman robes in our head. But little do people know that crucifixion, or haretsuki, used to be big in Japan, thanks mostly to the stories the Christians told the Japanese people after they arrived there in the 16th century. Those were Portuguese sailors who, after being blown off course, landed in a country that looked like no culture they'd ever laid their eyes on. Soon after, in 1549, Spanish missionaries arrived and witnessed feudal lords at war with each other, what's now known as the Warring States period. These Europeans were tolerated, and some of these lords sure liked the guns that the Europeans brought, but the gleam of God and firepower soon wore off, and in 1630 Japan introduced Sapuku, a closed country policy. The Europeans wrote about Japanese-style executions, which they said were common even for minor crimes. They explained that the condemned would usually be put on a horse and walked through the town, the manner of his crime written above him on a banner. In the cases of crucifixion, the condemned was tied to a cross with a rope rather than nailed. He wasn't left out to die under the elements, with the cause of death usually being a series of spear jabs to the body, a process known as kushizashi. The warrior class weren't involved with the actual killing. The reason was that they didn't want the public to think they were mean, so they got the outcast class to do the dirty work. These executioners often used a sword-like spear known as a yari. For centuries, yari were used by warriors in ritualized combat or battles, only to be replaced when fighting became more focused on close-quarters combat. There was no honor in crucifixion. The condemned person's body would be left on the cross for a few days in an outcast-run execution ground. And to add to the disgrace was the act of gokuman, the gates of hell. That was when the head was separated from the body and put on display, showing that even in death the accused would find no peace. Then there was water crucifixion, which seems was reserved for those pesky Christians. Known as Mizu Haritsuki, the condemned man would be left out at low tide on the cross and would slowly drown as the tide came in. This was obviously labor-intensive, so sometimes a simple decapitation would suffice. Number 3. Beheading. It's important to understand that the Japanese back then fully embraced discrimination in what you might call their extremely anti-PC culture. The samurai class was the top of the pack, above farmers, artisans, and then below them lowly merchants, and at the very bottom were the social outcasts, the beggars, the blood moppers, and the head choppers. The class structure was very strict, so even a lower-class samurai couldn't marry an upper-class samurai. The outcasts lived in slums and were not allowed to even consider marrying someone above them. There were various types of these bottom dwellers, such as the hinin, which translates to non-persons, and then there was the ita, which means great filth. And we can't forget about the senmin, which translates in English to the base people. All these poor outcast folks were associated with what the Japanese called kegare, which was related to social pollution, defilement, death, blood, taboos, or what we might call sin. The people above the outcasts wanted absolutely nothing to do with kegare if they could help it. But if a commoner broke the law, one of the punishments in at least one city was being sent to live among the filthy non-people. So the outcast certainly came in handy when it was time to torture and kill. The records show that once a person had been decapitated, 2 or 3 outcasts would push forward the torso and hold down the neck, so the blood would spurt into a ditch that they had just dug. They had to dispose of the body and clean the head, making sure that it was in a handsome state to put on display. When the body was left out for the public to view, the outcast stood by it day and night, ensuring no one mutilated or stole it. When the head needed parading through the streets, they were the ones who did the carrying. The reason for all of this was so that the warrior class could kill and still look benevolent. Of course, the public looked down on the outcasts as slaughterers and butchers, like as if they had a choice. But they also did the burning. So now let's have a look at that. Number 2. Burning. Burning at the stake, hayaburi, wasn't anywhere near as popular in medieval Japan as it was in Europe, but it happened. It was the outcasts who made the fire, tied the person to the stake, and they got rid of the charred body. It didn't happen often because it was usually reserved for arsonists. The good news is the condemned would usually die in a few minutes from smoke inhalation, but the bad news is a fire might be deliberately made to burn slowly, so yeah, it hurt a lot. In Europe, the accused witches or heretics were often strangled first as an act of mercy. But in Japan, the whole point of public execution was usually to maximize shame and suffering. Case in point, in 1683 in the city of Edo, now Tokyo, the daughter of a greengrocer was burned at the stake after being accused of arson. She'd apparently fallen in love during a big fire the year before, but the man of her dreams vanished afterward, so the next year she did what any hopeless romantic might do. She lit another fire hoping he'd show up again. Alas, her cunning plan failed. Even an accidental fire could get a person in big trouble. Given that all the houses were made of wood and one fire could spread and burn down an entire village, the Japanese of the Tokugawa period took a very dim view of people who let their kitchen stove get out of hand. The head of the family would have some serious apologizing to do, and if he was lucky, he might get away with doing some penance in a temple. In those days, lots of people ran off to the temple if they got in trouble, with a benevolent shogun occasionally announcing an amnesty. The absolute worst thing that could happen was being sawn. Number 1. Sawing and ripping in half. Far more gruesome was the prospect of being sawn in half, a practice known as noko giribiki. Again, the condemned would be paraded through the streets at the hands of the outcasts, armed with spears, and a banner with his punishment blowing above him in the wind. At the execution site, the outcasts dug a deep hole and buried him in the ground with only his head visible. He had to stay there for 2 or 3 days as the public walked over him. The worst part is that the saw that was to take his head off was made out of wood, so not quite as efficient as a power tool from Home Depot. The only other punishment worse than sawing was being ripped apart. Similar to European quartering, the condemned would have his limbs tied to 2 horses and then the horses were whipped, thereby pulling his limbs off. And you could guess who had to clean that up. All of this barbarism more or less finished when the Edo period ended in 1868 and the Meiji period began. The Meiji government introduced Kaitei Ritsurei, or the revised penal code, banning crucifixion, sawing, ripping, and burning at the stake. Today, Japan's method of capital punishment is hanging. It doesn't happen often, with just 98 inmates being executed since the year 2000. 83.1% of the public supported the death penalty in 2025, an increase from 2.3% from 5 years earlier, although we doubt that they want to bring back sawing. Think that was brutal? Watch insane Japanese torture methods used during World War II, Unit 731, to see how they took punishment to the next level. Or check this video out instead.